Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders, our new series where we're bringing experts in their respective fields and sharing their insights with you around what's going on in the macroeconomic environment today, and then what do they see as themes and trends in the near future. Today we got John Baird from Vouched. Would love to get a little bit more background on you, John, and then tell us a little bit about Vouched and who makes a good customer for you guys.
Sure thing. Hey, Chris, great to be here. Thanks for having me on. And, as you asked, what makes a great customer for Vouched? You know, really what we're seeing, we develop artificial intelligence for identity verification. And we really started in highly regulated, high risk industries. So we do a lot within banking and financial services. We do a tremendous amount within healthcare. And what's interesting is the identity problem within healthcare is just exploding in a lot of different ways. There's even risk to patient treatment around confusion or inaccurate identities of the patient. But what makes a really good customer for us is a business that is struggling with knowing who their users are and identifying those users in a way that is perfectly frictionless, right? And so we do a lot within e-commerce, especially if those goods that are being sold are of higher value. We do a lot in the automotive industry, both rentals of autos, RVs, et cetera, but certainly sales of those goods as well. The perfect customer for us is usually somebody, a business that is going through digital transformation, right? Really for the first time, those legacy industries, and realizing that so much of the operations of the business in the physical world was dependent upon that customer sitting across a desk from them, right? Or across a cash register from them. And then for the first time, they are realizing the workflow, the user experience, and the depth of the evaluation to verify identity is totally different in a digital world. And so we step in to help them with that problem.
Got it. And are you what kind of technology are you guys using to do the verification? Is it facial recognition, which kind of like I saw across there, or is it a few different types of offerings?
Yeah, so Vouched is extremely robust, right? We literally evaluate an individual, their identity with dozens and dozens of factors. And this is technology, artificial intelligence, and computer vision that we developed entirely in-house. So Vouched does a number of things. I won't provide an exhaustive list of what we do here, but I will just say it starts with facial recognition technology, as you mentioned, that we developed ourselves. So we look at that user in real time. We do what is called a liveness test, where we are evaluating based on certain movements or other factors that we are seeing from that user to establish, are they real? Are they alive? Or is it somebody trying to spoof us in some way? Vouch is also an expert on identity documents, driver's licenses, passports, identity cards from all over the world. And so we evaluate that information as well. And then, as I stated, there's dozens of additional criteria that are being evaluated as part of that individual. That whole process takes a few seconds to do the user experience with that user. And then all of that data goes back to the business, our customer, to be able to onboard that user.
Very cool. I got a lot of questions around the technology and just kind of like where things are today, because obviously it's so prevalent, I think, in this recent years of seeing that becoming more mainstream in terms of like the technology catching up to I think the ability to kind of like do these kinds of instant verifications in a much more sophisticated, robust way. But before we do that, would like to get to know about your background, because as I was kind of perusing, I just saw that you obviously done and been in marketing roles for a tremendous amount of time before starting Vouched. And so yeah, talk us a little bit about that. Like, what was your world or your previous chapter of your career like before Vouched?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's one thing about entrepreneurs is that oftentimes the path that they take is not, it's not a straight line.
Never.
And that's oftentimes actually what makes them good, because they're looking at a problem from a different perspective than all of the so-called experts, within that given industry, if you will.
Yep.
And so I was very fortunate. I actually began my career within crisis communications.
Okay.
And what I love about crisis communications, interestingly, is also a lot of what I love around working in artificial intelligence and identity. And that is, there's this big, gnarly problem that you are trying to solve, where, quite frankly, there is no known, there's not a blueprint, right, for how you do that. There are, in crisis communications, there are a number of factors that are changing dynamically. You have a myriad number of people that are pushing on that in different ways, or interpreting the problem in different ways. And it's really up to you to figure out, okay, how do we get our arms around this, and how do we communicate this in a way that everybody can understand, so that we can manage through this problem. So that's very much where I started. And then, interestingly, I also started working with all of, at the time, sort of early stage startups. So I was working with Amazon. At the time there, I did a lot of work with them. They were one of my clients. I worked with a company called drugstore.com, which Walgreens bought about 10 or so years ago. So I had a number of clients in the technology space, a number of B2B clients as well. And then I was extremely fortunate to join a company called Blue Nile, which was founded by Mark Vadon, who's just been extremely successful. And he was an amazing mentor to me. And, going inside of Blue Nile, there's this through line for, what we did there that leads all the way up to Vouched a decade plus later. But we were selling fine jewelry online. And at a time where very few people had even bought a book on Amazon for a few dollars, our average ticket was more than $6,000. Wow. And at the same time, because this was a little while ago, there were not great systems that had yet been built to be able to help a business understand who is the buyer of that item. And so one of the problems that we faced was, is the person that is buying this $6,000 plus item, are they legit? Right? Are they indeed who they claim to be? And we had a number of manual systems, really human-based systems, to try to figure out, is this person real? But that created a lot of friction for those users at the time. And sometimes we would lose a sale. And so that always stuck with me, right? Because I'm thinking about, like, how do you provide the best user experience, for an individual? Fast forward, like I said, a decade plus. Yeah. And I am actually doing a lot of work with autonomous cars. And I'm actually in Gothenburg, Sweden, the headquarters of Volvo. And this was around 2014. And we were in a Volvo on their ring road, the road that goes around Gothenburg. And it was actually sprinkling rain, and we're in rush hour traffic. And there's a PC jacked into the steering column of that car, and it's driving itself. Oh. And that really got me thinking, okay, if a car can drive itself, computer vision has now gotten to a point where it can begin to make accurate evaluations and accurate decisions that fundamentally change and improve a user experience, as well as the security of the company. And so as I'm looking around, I'm also realizing that you have these legacy industries, financial services, banking, healthcare, that really, for the first time, are going through digital transformation, but they do not have a sophisticated and satisfying way to understand who their users are. And so they had this twin problem, right? This tension in the problem. One was, if the security was too onerous, too heavy, they'd lose a ton of users. And we still see this when we go out and businesses come to us. They'll tell us how, they're losing 60%, 70% sometimes of their users with high intent to complete, because the identity process that they have in place is too slow, too onerous, too clunky. That's part of it. And then on the other side, the security just wasn't robust enough, right? And so they were getting beat by fraudsters a ton. In fact, a lot of my banks will make the joke that using the old systems, if somebody passed with flying colors, if they passed, we knew they were a fraudster, which is upside down, right, of what you would expect. It's counterintuitive. And so Vouch came out of that learning, right? We knew that digital transformation, digital period will take over the world, right? Every single industry, every single activity, every single transaction that we make. And so at its core, right, I was looking at this going, wow, right? Like there's this amazing opportunity both to improve the user experience for those consumers that are out there, move them through the workflow, the onboarding workflow of these customers, which equals more revenue for them.
Yep.
At the same time, right, help them beef up their security to keep the bad guys out.
Yeah. When was this the Volvo experience?
That was around, I want to say that was around 2014, maybe 2015. It's been a while. So my calendar, my mental calendar might be off a little bit. There was another piece to that story. After we were on the, after we were out driving the car, or the car was driving us actually. We went back to the headquarters and we were in one of the conference rooms, and one of the Volvo engineers was leading a presentation. He had a big, PowerPoint presentation up, and this beautiful slide up that with really high design, and it had like silhouettes of trees, a silhouette of like a mailbox, and I think there was a dog on one side, and there was a big old moose, a silhouette of a big moose like alongside the road. And I remember him saying like, the car can detect the moose and know how to react appropriately. And I'm going, why is there a moose on this slide, right? It's not something we talk about a lot, in the United States. And the answer is very clear if you live in Sweden. That's like a 3,000 pound, animal that you do not want to hit with your car. So it made a lot of sense in that context. And I always loved that anecdote.
Interesting. Okay, so about like 10 years ago from that Volvo experience, and then how from then, and then your background, how long before you started Vouched or went on the path to start, and what did that actually look like?
Yeah, I mean, in the early days, when I think about idea generation and innovation, again, I don't believe it is a straight line. And so, while that was certainly tremendous inspiration within that experience, that in and of itself was not the moment that I was like, oh, I have this great vision right for Vouched. It was not there was not a single eureka moment, if you will. There was tremendous stepping back and contemplating everything that I had experienced at that time. There were one of the other factors that was a big influence on me was, at the time, I had become very frustrated with what I felt like was technology sort of starting and stopping at the edges of the screen, right? What I mean by that is I just felt like technology and the way that we were interacting with it had not fundamentally changed in roughly a decade, right? The advent of Google and search, and that, it's a powerful tool, but I felt we should be doing more. And so when I really started to think about artificial intelligence and computer vision and cameras, right, within, and smartphones were still relatively new at the time, and they had been around for a few years by then. But the ability to utilize those cameras as a way to have visual inputs into the way that users were interacting with, an app or a website, or in our case, right, verifying identity. That was another big thing where I was like, okay, this starts to become spectacularly transformative, right? And our ability to do really complex tasks that we couldn't do at the time. So there were a couple years, right, where I sort of was after, I had the Volvo experience, if you will, the autonomous car experience, the Moose experience. Where I was really deeply reflecting on this, sketching out ideas, sketching out how, we apply this. There were certainly dead ends, right, to some of this exploration as well, where I was like, okay, like, this makes this idea that I was excited by for a moment, like didn't make any sense in application. And it was really around 2018, I kind of struck out there. I had assembled a small initial team who who wanted to go on this journey together. And, we started swinging away at what would become the MVP of the product. We got our first customer at that time. They were willing to go on this journey with us. And we also were accepted into Madrona Venture Labs as part of this. This is a couple of years in, right? Like, I invested a tremendous amount of time, right? Like, sort of doing, call it pre-work, up until now. So it really gets going around, that was 2018, we got that first customer. And then it was 2019, we got accepted into Madrona Venture Labs. And then we launched commercially at the end of 2019, coming out of Madrona.
Got it. Okay, so I would love to kind of dive into that little period between like 2015-ish to 2018, and you're dabbling around a few different ideas. You said a few of them obviously didn't work in application, but um, when you're dabbling with those ideas, were they all in a world that was around kind of like identity verification, or was it other variations of that necessarily isn't instrumental to like or like a part of the core of what Vouch does now?
Yeah. So, in the very beginning, I mean, like I said, the idea did not come fully formed. Didn't come in a dream. I wish it had. It was, it was very much like at the beginning, reflecting upon, quite frankly, like where I tend to start in any sort of problem solving and innovation journey is there's both the problem, but I think there's something much bigger, right? Which is, how do humans operate? And then how do they operate? And I personally tend to go very deep in this.
Yeah.
At the beginning, it was all around the importance of vision, right? Not computer vision and AI, but the importance of vision to humans, right? And so initially it was, thinking about, well, why, how do we utilize our vision, right? Like, and when you really start to think about it, you start to realize, we talked about autonomous cars, how humans begin to operate almost autonomously based on our vision, right? It is how we're navigating through our homes. It's the clothes that we buy, the cars, it's often the cars that we buy. It's not really the gas mileage. It's like, that's a beautiful car. It's who we date. It's very often the food we eat, right? Does it look appetizing? You think of, quite frankly, the almost baked into our psyche, the image of the red apple on the tree, right? Which has really, there's a reason why it is so prevalent, in society. It's the reason why one of the biggest companies in the world picked it as both their name and their symbol. And these things are extremely persuasive to us, both logically. I would say, it appeals to our senses, it appeals to our emotions. And so I was doing a tremendous amount of thinking just around vision and how we utilize it. So that was a lot, right? Like, that was probably a year of just thinking about that. And then how does it move our logical processes? And then how does that start to get applied, right, to business?
Yeah.
There was, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna ask you, during that year, or during those first few years before like getting to 2017, 2018, where it starts formalizing a little bit more, what were your circumstances? Were you still working full time and then doing this on the side? Did you quit to kind of pursue something already, or what was that situation?
Yeah, so there was definitely a period in there where I was working full time, and this was something that, starting a business was something that I had been thinking about for well over a decade by then, and actually planning for. I had been saving behind the scenes, knowing that the entrepreneurial journey is not one that often pays well. Let's just put it that way, especially in the beginning.
Yeah.
And so I'd saved a tremendous amount of money, and then eventually, struck out there on my own, knowing that we had some savings that we could live off of. I'm not sure how happy my wife was, because I was probably I wasn't 22 right out of school. and doing this. So we actually moved into a 550 square foot apartment that I was still in New York at that time, and it's about 550 square feet. We'd moved out a much nicer place. It was immediately above a Chinese Peruvian fusion restaurant. And it wasn't a fancy restaurant either. It was like packed and it was really loud. And we were immediately above that. It's basically a small studio apartment. And we had more than a few mice running around. And I think she was like, what are we doing? Right? Like if I was
What's going
trying
on? We're
to,
going backwards here.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. But no, and so just slugging away, right, in that period early on, and took that and it, brought on that initial team that I talked about, and yeah, we started working on that MVP product, and it was not born overnight. Let me just say
Yeah,
that.
yeah. But I guess like when to that point of like, so obviously you're more strategic, I think, than sometimes other founders are in terms of planning and in terms of you knew you were going to take this leap. You're fortunate you had a partner that was also, willing to go along for the ride. Being said, like when and I have a lot more questions around that, but when you go from solo person, like solo founder going on this journey to then like bringing on a team, right? When you brought on the team, was at that point you felt confident like this is what we're gonna do with what I've been spending my time and obsession around vision and practicalities as it could relate to business and how we're deducing things from vision. Did you have some semblance of a direction of what that business model would be like when you brought on the team? And at that time, when you brought on the team, were you bringing on co-founders? Were you bringing on employees? Were you paying them out of pocket? What was that? What was that like? And then, yeah, I would love to kind of like know between bringing on a team and then getting to an MVP, what that journey looked like.
Yeah, so I think early on, we knew computer vision would be transformative, right?
Okay.
Um, the before, well, we certainly had some hypotheses around where to apply it. Excuse me. Um, one of the things that I believe is that I love the saying like strong ideas held loosely. And so, we had some hypotheses around how this would develop, but we also, and I think this is very much just the way that I operate, is you're doing a lot of little tests to
Yeah.
see, oh, is this resonating, right? And you hear about the businesses, the founders that are like, we're going to go do X, right? And
Yeah.
we're just going to kill it. And then sometimes they do, right? And they're absolutely right. And it goes to the moon and great for them. But just as often, in fact, I would say even more often, they're committed to that idea and there's no buyer for
Yeah.
whatever the idea is. And they spend a ton bringing it to market. And yeah, nobody wants to buy. And so we were testing a few different things. One was we were testing, and it was really me, like we'd built, some like early MVPs, but it was really like, could I sell this to an actual buyer? So one of the things that we looked at was actually around real-time inventory on the shelf of a retailer. Right? Could we look and say, okay, whatever this product is, you need to go put it back on the shelf.
Yeah.
Because if you're in the retail world, if that item is not on the shelf, nobody's buying it. And that's a big problem. So the faster you can restock, right? That means your turns are faster, your inventory turns are faster, more revenue, et cetera.
That was
Uh,
like one of the product iterations was like managing SKUs through vision, computer vision.
yeah, well, we never found a buyer for it, so we didn't invest into it. Like we didn't have it, like it was more.
That was one of the ideas, I suppose.
That was one of the ideas, yes. I also remember having a fascinating conversation with some dentists, and they wanted us to apply it actually to diagnosis of it's actually sores in the mouth, and they wanted us to build an initial prototype for them of that. it ultimately didn't go anywhere. But what was fascinating about that conversation, I was like, well, don't you guys, like, you look in mouths all the time. Can't you diagnose them, right? Like, isn't this what you do? And I remember one of them said that dentists can only agree about 65% of the time of a diagnosis of a cavity. And I was like, well, that really freaks me out. I don't know how accurate that is, but I remember him telling me that. And that ultimately didn't go anywhere. And then it was ultimately identity verification that really started to resonate as I talked to banks and healthcare. And interestingly, one of our very first customers was actually in the gig economy, where they were, it was a business where their customers would go and hire an individual with a truck. They didn't own a truck to like move their furniture across town, or go pick up I don't know, a load of lumber from Home Depot and bring it to them. And they'd had a lot of problems with those individuals being fraudulent.
Okay.
And you can imagine, you're like, hey, move my stuff across town. Guy shows up in a truck. You never see that guy again.
Yeah.
So that was one of our very first customers. It was a small customer, but it let us, really launch that first version of the product. We had to do so much elbow grease on that to get that first customer. We did a custom integration with them, et cetera. But we were thrilled, and we were doing. They probably only paid us a few $100s a month, but we were doing backflips.
Yeah. Awesome. Um, I want to get a little bit more into that granular part of that experience, right? So you mentioned now just time. I'm trying to think through the timeline wise, because I think a lot of founders a lot of founders don't get to the other side of just even some of these steps that you've already talked about, right? Let alone where you are now with Vouched in terms of traction and just the size of the company and the scope and the length of it. But I think like kind of that's why I was digging at those different ideations and the different things, because sometimes people just go in, bullheaded with just one idea, and then they don't realize, look, I got to pivot to like 15 ideas here to actually test what the market will buy before I go and center down that one path. And it seems like you were smart enough to go do that and then landed on to this the ID verification, the identity verification. At which point I would love to get some more clarity. Was like, at this point, you and your team are like, this is it. I have enough kind of social proof from talking to other side of the market that people would buy for this, right? And then what happens then from, we need to focus here, and then how do you go about building, especially, I don't know if you're a technical founder or not. I'm thinking probably not. So
Yeah.
how do you, as a non-technical founder, then go and build something that is really technical at the end of the day?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the first is like one of the things coming from more on the marketing side, and it wasn't just marketing, right? It was observing other founders, other entrepreneurs, but this idea of constantly testing and then taking the data in and realizing, okay, basically you're doing a lot of A/B testing, right? Like
Yeah.
option A is working okay, but option B is killing it. We're going to invest in option B. And I think that very much that plus again observing other founders, right, who had overcommitted to a single idea without testing into that idea, very much influenced how I think about things. I think it's also just part of my DNA where to my personal way of thinking, right, like committing to a single path when there are tremendous unknowns within that, and not giving yourself the flexibility, right, to go, oh, okay, like turns out path A is a dead end. We need to like be able to turn and go to path B. That doesn't the lack of flexibility doesn't compute to me. And so like you're taking in data all of the time, and then you're moving very quickly to the options that do work. So that was part of the way that we operate. And I wouldn't say I do it perfectly, right? Like there's no perfect in this. It's easy to tell a overly simple story in a podcast, but in reality, right, these decisions are extremely hard and you think you figured it out. I mentioned the dental example earlier, and I was like, oh, this is gonna be great, right? These guys are ready to go and they're gonna pay us, blah, blah, blah. And they just disappeared one day. We never heard from them again, right? And like they just ghosted us. And I had probably been talking to them a few months by that point. And so, I think when it came to identity verification, there was both an abundance of what I would say is sort of observable market data, the qualitative data, right? You've got all of these businesses, like I said, these industries going through digital transformation really for the first time. And a part of my personal experience had been working with those businesses and realizing how far behind they were in making that transition to digital. And so I knew that there was opportunity just within that, right, within those cultures. Then, seeing the other piece of data there was what was the state of the art at the time and realizing how bad it was. So you're just seeing this flood, right, of digital transformation. They're all going to need identity verification. And then I think, there is no better proof point than somebody is willing to pay you for this. And so as you're starting to get the first customer and they're willing to give you money, that was when we were like, that's it. And then the other thing that happened, and this was probably a false positive, or at least a partial false positive, I got another 30 companies to sign up to go live with us.
Did you have a product at this point yet?
I'm sorry?
You guys have a product at this point already?
We did. We had an early version of the product that a couple
Okay.
early adopters were using, very small. And then I went out and got another 30 companies to sign up with us. And but only like 4 of those ever actually went live, right? Like 6 months went by and I'm like, I'm super excited. I've got these 30 plus companies that have signed up, and then they all just start like,
Yeah.
they weren't serious, right? And that was a fascinating learning for me as a first-time entrepreneur, that you can get people to say yes, you can even get them to sign on the dotted line, but they have no intention of following through. But out of that 30, and I think this was another good lesson, right? Out of that 30, like 4 actually did become customers. And so part of that was, okay, we're going to go have to sign up a really big number, and then a smaller percentage of them will actually convert to paying customers. And so, it gave me some insight into how to go out and manage customer acquisition, right? And then some early ability to forecast around, how that will turn into revenue. And then part of it's still part of our story was land and expand. And so a lot of those early customers started out very, very small. And today those accounts some of those accounts in the beginning were like, it's like $50 a month. And today on an annual basis, right, they're often paying us, $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 plus. So you can't know it all. I think that's out. You just can't, as much as you want to, right? You want everything to just everything to like fall in a nice, neat little boxes. It's not going to work. But we dug in hard into winning those first customers, evolving the product, improving the product based on their feedback, right? And there was a tremendous amount of iteration there. And those customers grew up with us, and they're some of our best customers to this day.
Got it. Yeah, I think to your point, I would say it's never cookie cutter, and it's never like wrapped up in a nice box with a pink bow on it. But I would say there are certain things that speak to, your personal characteristics that I've seen in a lot of other founders. I think like, but just the humility and the natural curiosity, right? 'Cause there's other people who work in marketing, other people who work in different, department heads that they just stick to their job. They're not curious about the entrepreneur or the leader or the CEO role and what they're doing right or wrong or whatever. They're not observing, from the sidelines, probably like you were, with the intent of like going out and knowing that you're going to go pursue something else, right? So I think there's something to be said in that, because I think like if there's somebody who is thinking like that, there is a path, right? There is a path to actually going and starting something on your own. If you have this morbid curiosity to yourself and you're noticing all these things, you wish that the boss did this differently because there's these other better optimization flows. You need to figure out how to plan and then maybe ultimately take the execution steps to go and pursue something. Um,
Yes.
because I see that, and I
The
see that
best.
exactly what your story is, right? It's like you're
Yeah.
like carefully like strategically planning in the back of your mind while you're like, making other people money, but like you had it in your own wherewithal to kind of like, I'm gonna learn as much as I possibly can in these situations, quietly, and then I'm gonna go take it into practice.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think to be a great entrepreneur, and that sounds very arrogant. Well, it remains to be seen if I'm a great entrepreneur, right? But I think these characteristics are core to great entrepreneurs. Curiosity is one, right? Like you're just sort of endless. You're like a 2-year-old, right? You're asking why constantly. And you're never satisfied with what the answer is. And I think the other one is that you have a contrarian mindset, right? You are spectacularly annoyed by the status quo.
Yeah,
And we're not always fun to be around, right? Because we're like, why isn't this better? Why isn't this better?
yeah,
Why can't we go faster here? But that's where, right, like improvement and innovation comes from, thinking about there's got to be a better way to do this. I frequently will tell the story that um, if I go into a store that does not have self-checkout, I will walk out because I'm not standing in that line. And it's a signal to me that the business does not care about me enough to give me a better experience, to provide self-checkout, so that I will shop there. And so I will literally I will pay more because my time is valuable at a place that provides self-checkout and I can get in and out fast than go to a place that makes me
yeah.
wait. And I mention that only because I think that's the mindset of entrepreneurs. Are like, wait, there's a better way. I'm going to the better way. If the better way doesn't exist, I'm going to go build it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I would even just add, it's like, I don't even think great entrepreneur. I think if you're an entrepreneur that's getting paid, like you're successful, like you're already in a group that's, a lot of people can call themselves entrepreneurs, but unless you're like paying yourself a salary from your business of some sort, that is a different category, right? I think like that's a different category of entrepreneur. That's like you are legitimately building something that has revenue, has customers typically, and that's a different place to be than just somebody saying I'm an entrepreneur and I'm gonna go do this thing when they are unemployed and not doing anything really yet. So which a lot are out there doing that. So I mean, I think like that's a good way to kind of differentiate. But kind of going into now the business of vouching, you talked a lot about kind of like how you got to the idea, how you got to your first few customers and building out the team. I would love to kind of just spend the last few minutes here that we have just to talk about, how has this industry progressed? Because I can imagine that a lot of this is also, I think, timing, a little bit of luck, right? In addition to obviously working your ass off and then finding the right problem to solve. But finding the right problem to solve at the right time is also super critical. Do you feel like that played any part in terms of the success you guys have seen today? And then I think it's still very somewhat infant stages, and I think there's still a lot more commercialization out there for this kind of technology. So I'm curious as to where you foresee that being in the next like year, 2, 3 years from now, especially with the more commercial adoption of just AI in general.
Yeah, I mean, I do think timing was definitely important, and especially there were two things, right? You really saw, again, banking, healthcare in particular, going through this massive, digital transformation. Certainly, the rise of fintechs in recent years. What I would say is really the first inning of digital medicine, right? The first phase of digital medicine has started over the past few years. We're going to see tremendous transformation for healthcare in general, digitally. So we're at the very beginning of that trend. That was part of it. Also, what we built on the AI and computer vision side, we were able to build an entirely automated system.
Yeah.
solution, right? Whereas legacy players in this space were and continue to be very dependent upon humans to do a big chunk of this work. And so the way that usually works is that your identity data, your PII, is actually getting sent offshore for humans to do the review. It might look digital
Yeah.
to you as a user, but behind the scenes, there are people internationally reviewing your identity data. And I always just felt like humans can't scale to this work. The complexity of identity gets harder into the future, not easier. And then there is a time and a cost problem to that level of operational overhead. And so you had to build, and we set out to build and did build a fully automated AI solution there. And so I think that was critical for the time. So that timing, to your point, was all correct. And then I think, your next question was like, kind of, where does the need for identity verification go from here? What's the business demand? And you mentioned this, right? Like, it's very early. I mean, it's very, very early. And one of the things that I believe is true about identity and is counterintuitive about identity is, in some ways, it'll never be fully figured out. And the reason for that is our identity, what makes up our identity today is far more complex than it was 10, 20 years ago. So therefore, the future of identity is far more complex. There's more data points. There will be, additional things that we will evaluate of an individual to ensure that individual is indeed who they say they are. In parallel, you have additional governmental requirements that didn't exist previously. And so you see this, there's something called the 6th AML directive out of Europe, which is now requiring identity in a very specific way for certain purchases, things like jewelry, art, antiques, that didn't exist previously. There's a brand new, the Corporate Transparency Act has new requirements for financial services that just kicked in on January 1. So more governmental requirements in a very specific way. And then the third piece of this is fraud, right? Like fraud, the fraud in 2022 for financial services increased 79%. I mean, 79%, right? That is not small. Another stat that just blows my mind, PPP loans, right? It is estimated that there was up to, this number should terrify people. There was up to $1 trillion in fraudulent PPP loans given out. The US is a very wealthy nation, but we can't lose more than a few $1 trillion before it starts to add up, right? And so the sophistication of fraud is, growing very rapidly. The volume of fraud is even more scary. And what I would also say is, like, you have rogue nations, right, that they've industrialized fraud. They have it's some of their biggest growth areas.
Yeah.
They're investing into it massively because they can make so much money at it.
Wow. On that note, quite a bit for us to think about. But I want to say thank you for your time and sharing us a little bit more about your journey, about what you guys are doing, and how it's going to line us up for the future of technology as it relates back to identity verification and all that stuff. So it was super interesting to hear your journey and just kind of get your background and see how you've evolved into the entrepreneur you are today. And thanks so much for sharing for me and also for our audience.
Awesome. Chris, thanks for having me. Had a great time.
Of course, thank you.